Thanks very much, Derek, for that very interesting presentation. Very pleased to see that Toronto's subway cars are partnering with our good friends in Lagos, but you're not alone. Those of you from Nigeria, Boston actually reuses Toronto's commuter rail cars, so we seem to specialize in the adaptive reuse of rail-based technology. So, and thanks for your work. I'm quite proud that Canadians are involved in that really advanced work. Our final speaker, and we will have a few minutes for questions after, is Robert Palter, who is the Director, Senior Partner of McKinsey, Toronto. I think McKinsey and Company needs no introduction. In fact, everywhere I go in the world, McKinsey is there. They're the premier consultancy, I think, internationally. Robert is the leader of the infrastructure practice for North and South America, while the primary focus of his client work is with investors like pension funds, private equity funds, and corporations looking to participate in infrastructure assets. He has very broad experience on a variety of infrastructure topics. By way of background, he has an MBA from the University of Western Ontario, an Honours Bachelor of Arts in International Relations from the University of Toronto, and he was named one of Canada's top 40 under 40 in 2006, and also has a number of charitable and community-based activities, very important in our context. Robert, we're looking forward to your remarks.
So what I'm going to try to do is I'm going to try to take you in about 10 minutes or less, because we're up against the clock here, through a study on infrastructure that McKinsey released in January of this year. We did a global study of infrastructure practices to try and figure out how to solve the infrastructure challenge globally. And the intent of this presentation is actually to follow up on some of the remarks that the Minister and the Senator made about some of the challenges and the opportunities they're facing. So here are the key messages in our report. As everybody knows, there is a very significant need for capital to build infrastructure, but the real problem is how do we actually find that capital? And one of the things that McKinsey has observed through our client work and through events like this is that the typical response to that question is we need to find more capital, we need to find more investors. We stood back and we thought about the problem slightly differently, and we said, yes, that's true, but what we really need to do is find a way to use less capital to build infrastructure, because there is only a finite supply of capital and there's an ever-increasing demand for infrastructure projects. So what we did is we went around the world looking for case examples of jurisdictions, particularly at the urban level, that were doing interesting and innovative things to reduce the amount of capital. We found 400 different case examples from around the world. And when you stand back and you look at those 400 case examples, you can distill the activities that these organizations are doing down into three broad areas. The first one is they are dramatically improving the way they go about infrastructure project planning and selection. The second thing that they're doing is they are rethinking the delivery of projects and streamlining it. And then lastly, and maybe most controversially, is they are doing much more to get more out of the existing infrastructure. Just to make the point, the typical response in a city that is congested is let's build new infrastructure, rather than saying what can we do to get more out of our existing infrastructure before we actually raise money to build something new. And so what I want to do is just quickly take you through some of these findings. Our analysis would indicate that globally, between now and 2030, roughly $57 trillion needs to be raised for infrastructure. There are lots of reports out there which say how much money there is. We can debate whether 57 trillion is right. It actually really doesn't matter because the number is so incredibly large. What is interesting, however, is when you stand back and you look at it, there's a lot of discussion about urban transportation, housing, and the like. The reality is where the money is going to go is into power and water. And the reason for that is in emerging economies, as everybody probably well appreciates, that money into power and water drives economic growth. The other interesting thing about our research into this topic is that when we looked around globally to see how much money people were actually spending on infrastructure, what we kind of stumbled on through a little bit of pattern recognition is that countries are spending, on average, about 71% of their GDP on infrastructure capital stock. Now, what you see is a very broad spectrum on that number, where at the far end you have Japan, which has got about 179% of GDP invested in infrastructure capital stock, and at the other end you've got Brazil, which is spending less than 15%. But on average, as a rule of thumb in countries, for a typical infrastructure platform to support economic growth, it's about 70% of GDP. And as I said, the number is big and growing. What you see here is McKinsey's projection for how much money will be required for infrastructure globally out to about 2030. Today, the number, we spend on average about $2.5 trillion annually for infrastructure. It's our forecast that by 2030 that number grows to somewhere between $4.1 trillion and $4.8 trillion. Why is that relevant? That's relevant because basically in the next 15 years or so we will have to more than replace all the existing infrastructure on the face of the planet. It's a very large number. So, how do we solve the problem which says we have a lot of infrastructure we need to build and a finite supply of capital? Well, when we stood back and we did our research, three things jumped out. One is, and I'm going to actually start at the bottom of this page, the opportunity to reduce the amount of capital required to get infrastructure built starts by asking the question, how do we get more out of existing infrastructure? How do we think about applying lean operations principles? How do we think about applying total cost of ownership and maintenance to buses to keep them running longer? How do we think about congestion pricing or information systems to shift demand patterns so that we don't need to build new infrastructure? The second thing we need to think about is project selection. Anybody here who's participated in P3 programs or is trying to develop infrastructure knows that the number one complaint from investors is that typically the projects that come to market aren't attractive projects and aren't well structured. And then lastly, how do we think about project delivery and streamlining project delivery? How do we deliver projects faster with less capital? How do we streamline planning? How do we streamline siting? How do we streamline approvals? I like to put this picture in the presentation for those of you who can see it. It's a house in China. And as you can see, there's a road going around that house. And the reason for that is that when they were doing the siting and permitting for this road, even in China, they did not sufficiently plan for land expropriations. So as the asphalt pavers were coming down the road, that house was still there. So what did they do? They just paved around it. And there are hundreds of examples of this globally. And finding ways to streamline siting and permitting avoids mistakes like this. So what does that all mean? So I've told you that we think that we need to find significant ways to reduce the amount of capital. If you believe that the annual number for infrastructure spend is somewhere around $3 trillion on average in the future, our analysis would say that through better project selection, streamlining the delivery of those projects, and making the most out of existing infrastructure, you could reduce that capital requirement by about 40%. All three levers, 40% reduction in the amount of money required to deliver infrastructure projects. And I will point out that a good chunk of it actually relies on making the most out of existing infrastructure, which is why we're emphasizing focusing there. Let me give you some examples of poor execution and good execution. This is a terrible chart for this room because it's far too busy, but what it is a picture of Japan. Japan is the poster child for poor project selection. They simply had a GDP stimulus program where they spent money on infrastructure. And what you see here are pictures of 17 bridges to nowhere. Those bridges got built, which is nice. They employed people for the 2 or 3 years that they were building bridges, but in reality, nobody works there, and there's no economic activity on either side of those bridges. So this is a case example of poor project selection. So how do you solve that problem? Again, this is a busy chart, but what this is the process map that the Singapore government uses for approving infrastructure projects. And the important point on this chart is that what they have here is a very sequenced, very streamlined process where there are clear checks and balances to ensure that what infrastructure projects go to market align with the national program to drive economic development. And that's basically what that chart says. Let me shift now to the next bucket, which is streamlining the delivery of projects. McKinsey's done a lot of work on infrastructure projects around the world, and we believe that there's probably an opportunity to take about 30% out of the capital cost of any individual infrastructure project through differences in engineering, procurement, and construction. Let me give you some details on this. Let's start with tendering and procurement. One of the obstacles that we see with infrastructure projects globally is the tendering process. It tends to be quite laborious, tends to be expensive, and it tends not to get the best solutions for governments. So how do we think about solving that problem? Using things like global sourcing, supplier development, the creation of centralized P3 units that have common scorecards and capabilities of people to run these processes. Those things together can streamline delivery. Let me talk about engineering. Invariably what you'll see on the engineering side, and this is not to impugn my friend Derek, but what you'll see invariably on the engineering side is a relatively rote approach to building many standard elements of infrastructure. What you see here is a case example of a road, and invariably what happens is roads get paved where both lanes have the same thickness of asphalt on them. When you ask the question why, given that trucks are required by law to only stay in the right lane, why do you pave the left lane to the thickness of truck weight? Most people say because that's the way we've always done it. The answer is, well, maybe we should rethink that and use a little less asphalt and save a little bit of money. Let me move now to contract management. This is an incredibly important issue in the delivery of infrastructure. There's a big evolution going on in contracting, particularly between governments and engineering and construction firms. And the way I like to think about it is governments are going to a contracting discussion with an EPC firm is like two people going to a fight. One has got a machine gun and the other one's got a knife. And one of the things that governments need to do is raise their games on how they actually contract and the skills that they bring to the table and the variety of options of contracting structures that they've got to ensure that there's an appropriate risk transfer and an appropriate pricing of that risk, because invariably governments try to transfer too much risk and it costs them too much money. The next part of streamlining delivery is the construction sector. What you see here is a chart comparing the labor productivity of the German and the American construction sectors relative to their economies starting back in 1989. And I realize that this is a very Western world example, but it's one where the data is good and clean. But this phenomenon exists just about anywhere in the world where infrastructure happens. What you see on this chart is that the German and the U.S. economies, generally speaking, have had pretty significant increases in productivity over the last 20 years. However, when you look at their construction sectors, what you see is that productivity of those construction sectors have actually been declining. Why is that? Well, there's no single reason for that. There are several reasons, between changing labor laws, between lengthening supply chains, between more congestions around construction sites, between changing safety regulations. There are a whole host of reasons why. But if we're going to try to get more infrastructure for fewer dollars of capital, one of the issues that needs to be resolved is labor productivity. Let me just move to a bit of the evidence on the point that I started on, which is getting more out of existing infrastructure. McKinsey's done work with urban rail operators, airports, ports, toll road operators globally, applying concepts such as lean operations, design to value, design to cost, total cost of ownership, in an effort to get more out of existing infrastructure. And we've found opportunities, for example, to improve the throughput in airports by 20% without adding a single dollar in new capital. We've been able to debottleneck ports and move 30 to 35% more containers through existing facilities without adding a dollar of capital. And starting the infrastructure journey there is where we would say the opportunity lies. Lastly, thinking creatively about technology on this issue. What you see here on this chart is a cost-benefit analysis of a variety of different technologies to debottleneck existing infrastructure. At the top of the chart, what you see is roads. Roads typically have a 2.7 to 1 cost-to-benefit ratio, which means you get about $2.7 of GDP benefit for every dollar you spend on a road, versus something like optimized traffic signals at the bottom, where you could get anywhere between $17 and $62 for every dollar you spend. And so again, rather than going for the new road to debottleneck, to actually start the journey with new technology. So with that, I'm going to stop and turn it over back to Mr. Miller.
Thanks very much, Robert. As usual, very powerful insights from McKinsey, and I very much like the last point about using infrastructure more efficiently by thinking in innovative ways. And I think it actually matched some of what the Minister was saying about the current thinking in Nigeria. Unfortunately, we don't have time for questions. If this was any other time of the day, I would extend this panel because I think it's a very rich one, but we are what is standing between you and lunch. So I don't think it's appropriate to extend it any further, but I did want to thank our speakers, and particularly the Senator and the Minister for their presentations, and to Derek and Robert for their very insightful comments. Thank you very, very much. Lunch is served somewhere, so enjoy. Maybe